In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. This is the record of the 121st Brontian Longknives, 5th Company, 2nd Platoon, 3rd Squad. 11 men conscripted from Hive Brontium in the 973rd year of the 41st Millennium. Their names were recorded in the tide ledgers of the Departamento Munitorum. Their faces were captured once, in grainy pic footage before deployment. Their deaths were never confirmed. This is their story, assembled from recovered Vox logs, data slates pulled from the ash, and the testimony of those who survived long enough to remember them. They were ordinary men sent to do the Emperor's work in a war without end. They were forgotten before they ever fell. On the 3rd day of October, the conscription order arrived in Hive Brontium's lower districts. 70,000 souls were selected by lottery, their names drawn from population data cores maintained by the Administratum for 3 centuries. They came from forge works and promethium refineries, from hab-block slums and transit corridors. Guardsmen designate Morton Craik left behind a wife and unborn child. Guardsmen designate Jens Valha had been a tunnel rat in the Underhive. Guardsmen designate Paul Hennick was 17, still bearing acne scars beneath his fear. They gathered in Processing Station Gamma 7, stripped of their names and given numbers. They would not see their home world again. The transport journey to the regimental training world of Pyros Secundus took 4 months through the warp. In the belly of the troop ship Unrelenting Duty, the conscripts learned their first lesson. They were cargo now, nothing more. 12,000 souls pressed into hold chambers designed for 8. The air tasted of sweat and recycled fear. Some prayed to the God Emperor. Others vomited until there was nothing left. Craik wrote letters to his wife that would never be sent. Valor sharpened the knife he'd smuggled aboard, its edge catching the red emergency lighting like a promise. When they finally emerged into real space, many had already begun the transformation from citizen to soldier. The rest would follow, or they would die. Pyros Secundus was a world of red dust and endless drill fields. For 6 months, they learned to march, shoot, and die on command. Commissar Thaddeus Vale oversaw their indoctrination with the cold precision of a man who had shot 17 conscripts for cowardice and felt nothing. He walked between the ranks during morning formation, his power sword catching the light, searching for weakness. "You are not men," he told them on the first day. "You are last rounds in the Emperor's rifle. You will be spent when he requires it." They learned the Imperial infantryman's uplifting primer until they could recite its lies in their sleep. They learned to field strip their laser guns in 30 seconds. They learned that their lives meant nothing and their deaths might mean even less. But something else grew in those months beneath the Pyro sun, something the Commissariat could not quite extinguish. 3rd Squad became brothers not through love, but through shared suffering. Craik, the oldest at 32, became their sergeant when the previous holder of that rank collapsed from heat exhaustion and was shipped to a penal legion. Valar never smiled, but he watched their backs with the paranoid intensity of a hive ganger. Hennick remained terrified, but learned to hide it behind dark humor that kept them sane during the worst days. Guardsman Lev Kortner spoke little, but could strip and clean a flamer in darkness. Guardsman Mikkel Jost claimed to have seen the God Emperor in a fever dream. No one believed him, but everyone envied his certainty. They became not individuals, but component parts of a single organism designed for one purpose: to kill and to die in the Emperor's name. On the 234th day, they received their regimental designation and their orders. The 121st Brontian Longknives would deploy to the Malachite sector, where Orc War. Grimtooth had overrun 17 Imperial worlds in 6 years. 3rd Squad was assigned to 5th Company, 2nd Platoon, under Lieutenant Anders Voss, a man who had survived 3 campaigns and lost his faith somewhere in the mud of the 2nd. They stood at attention while servitors branded their regimental tattoos into flesh. They received their full kit: flak armor scarred from previous owners, laser guns that had killed before and would kill again, ration packs marked with supply codes from wars 10 years ended. They were ready. They would never be ready. The voyage to Malachite Prime took another 3 months. This time, they traveled not as conscripts, but as soldiers, packed into the troop decks of the His Hammer Falls, a strike cruiser older than some regiments. The ship bore scars from a dozen void battles, its hull patched with prayers and ceramite. In the darkness between stars, 3rd Squad played cards with thumb-worn deck, told lies about women they'd known, and tried not to think about what awaited them. Voss visited their section once, his officer's cap gripped tight in his hands. "When we hit the ground," he said, "stay with your squad. Don't try to be heroes. Heroes die in the first hour." Then he left, and they understood. He was as frightened as they were, and that terror felt almost like honesty. Malachite Prime burned beneath them. From the troop bay viewports, they watched the planet's death. Fires visible from orbit, ash clouds where cities had been, the green atmospheric scarring where orc spores had taken root. The briefing had been simple. Reclaim Bastion Irongate, a fortress monastery that controlled the northern wastes. Intelligence estimated 3,000 orcs held the position. Intelligence was wrong. The drop began at 0400 hours, standardized Imperial time. 100 dropships descended through flak fire so thick it looked like rain. 12 were destroyed before reaching the ground. 3rd Squad's Valkyrie took a hit that killed the pilot and sent them into a screaming dive. They hit hard, crashing through the roof of a ruined manufactorum. Guardsman Paul Hennick was laughing when they pulled him from the wreckage, laughing and bleeding from both ears. They had landed 3 kilometers south of the designated zone, separated from 5th Company, alone in the ruins. Sergeant Craig checked his squad. 11 men had boarded the Valkyrie. 10 had survived the crash. Guardsman Mikkel Tausch had been crushed when the troop compartment collapsed, his final scream cut short by metal. They left his body in the wreckage with a quick prayer and moved out. The Vox was chaos. Overlapping orders, screams, the wet snarl of orc war cries bleeding through Imperial frequencies. Lieutenant Voss's last transmission was simple. All units converge on Irongate. The Emperor protects, then static, then gunfire that sounded like the world ending. 3rd Squad moved north through the ash, following the sound of distant artillery, knowing they were marching towards something that would consume them. They found the war in the ruins of what had been a shrine city. The orcs had swept through weeks earlier, leaving only bones and faith. 3rd Squad moved through streets of rubble where bodies lay in positions of prayer, their faces turned toward a god who had not answered. Hennick vomited quietly behind a broken statue. Jost knelt and made the sign of the Aquila. Valar checked corners with his lasgun raised, trusting nothing. They moved like ghosts through a necropolis, following roads that led north. In the distance, Bastion Irongate rose against the burning sky, a fortress of black stone and Imperial eagles surrounded by an ocean of green. The orcs numbered not in thousands but tens of thousands, a tide of violence that made mockery of all strategy. 3rd Squad had been sent to retake that fortress with 10 men. Even they understood the bitter joke. They dug in that night in the shell of a ruined administratum building, taking turns on watch while the horizon glowed with tracer fire. Craig rationed their supplies. 3 days of rations remained, ammunition for perhaps 2 engagements if they were careful. The Vox offered only static and screams. They were cut off, alone, forgotten by the Imperium they served, and yet they did not run. Courtner asked why, his voice barely audible above the distant gunfire. Because, Craig said slowly, running just means dying somewhere else. It was not courage that held them. It was the understanding that their lives had ended the moment they boarded that transport on Brontium. Everything after was borrowed time. They would spend it here in fire and faith, because that was all they had left to give. At dawn, they moved again, threading through the dead zone that surrounded Bastion Irongate. The Orcs had poisoned the ground with chemical weapons scavenged from Imperial stocks, and now the earth itself was toxic. They wore rebreather masks that filtered the worst of it, their vision reduced to fogged eyepieces and the shapes of their brothers ahead. The Orcs came in the green mist, appearing like nightmares. Massive shapes with crude axes and chain weapons, roaring their joy at finding fresh meat. Third Squad formed a firing line by instinct. Laser guns barked in perfect sequence, each man firing, moving, firing again. They had drilled this 1,000 times on Pyros. Now it kept them alive. 8 Orcs fell before the rest retreated into the mist. Guardsman Jost took an axe blade across his shoulder and kept fighting, blood mixing with chemical residue. They bound his wound with field dressings and moved on. There was nowhere to evacuate the injured. There was only forward. By midday, they reached the outer defensive line, or what remained of it. Imperial trenches stretched for kilometers, now filled with bodies wearing both Brontian colors and the green of the enemy. They found survivors in a bunker complex. 17 guardsmen from 3rd Platoon, defending a position that no longer mattered against an enemy that would not stop. The corporal in charge, a woman named Sarah Vex, with burn scars covering half her face, looked at Craig's 10 men and laughed bitterly. "Another squad to feed the grinder," she said. But she shared her ammunition anyway. And her intelligence. The Orcs were massing for a final assault on Irongate. When they came, nothing would stop them. The fortress would fall, the sector would fall, and then the Orcs would move on to the next world, and the next, until the Imperium bled them dry, or they drowned in green violence. "How long until the assault?" Craig asked. Vex checked her chronometer. 6 hours, maybe less. They spent the remaining time preparing to die properly. Ammunition was distributed, 42 charge packs for 27 guardsmen. Grenades were counted and set where they could be reached quickly. Courtner primed his flamer, whispering the litany of ignition like a prayer. Hennick carved his name into the bunker wall with the others who had defended this place, adding his mark to a wall of the dead and dying. Valor sharpened his knife again, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone oddly comforting. Jost led them in prayer, his voice gaining strength as others joined. "The Emperor protects. His will is our shield. His wrath is our sword." They did not believe it, but they spoke the words anyway, because faith was another kind of ammunition, and they would need everything they had. The Orcs came with the dusk, their war cry audible kilometers away, a sound like the world tearing itself apart. 3rd Squad took positions along the trench line, each man's sector of fire marked by dead ground and improvised range markers. Craig moved among them, checking weapons, meeting eyes. He said nothing. There was nothing left to say. The roar grew louder, the ground began to shake, And then they saw them. A wave of green stretching horizon to horizon. Thousands upon thousands of orcs charging with the mindless joy of creatures born for violence. They came with crude weapons and salvaged tanks, with war bikes and crude artillery pieces, with nothing but hunger for battle. Lieutenant Voss's voice crackled over the Vox one final time. All units, hold the line. For the Emperor. Then the artillery began. The Imperial guns spoke first. Basilisks positioned behind Iron Gate, their shells screaming overhead to detonate in the Orc advance. The explosions tore gaps in the green tide, but the gaps closed immediately. The Orcs did not care for casualties. They came on, roaring, and the guardsmen opened fire. Last fire lit the twilight, thousands of beams lancing into the charging horde. Orcs fell by the dozen, by the 100. It did not matter. For every one that fell, 2 more took its place. The range closed. 500 meters, 400, 300. Grenades arced out from the Imperial line. Heavy bolters chewed through flesh and crude armor. Still they came. At 100 meters, Craig gave the order to fix bayonets. The sound of steel sliding into place was lost in the roar of violence. At 50 meters, the wave hit. The battle became chaos incarnate. Orcs poured into the trenches, too close for last fire, fighting with fists and blades and pure savage joy. Third Squad fought as they had trained, moving as one organism. Craig shot an orc in the face at point-blank range, bayoneted another. Valor moved like liquid violence, his knife finding throats and eyes. Kortner unleashed his flamer in a confined space, turning the trench into a crematorium. Hennick fought with a trenching tool, his fear transformed into mechanical brutality. Jost screamed prayers while he killed, his faith and his violence indistinguishable. They held their section of trench for 17 minutes. In that time, 3 more of their number fell. Guardsman Lev Kortner dragged down by an orc knob that took 4 men to kill. Guardsman Willem Cross torn apart by a crude chain weapon. Guardsman Sarah Vex shot in the spine by friendly fire from a panicking conscript. The living kept fighting because stopping meant dying, and dying meant the orcs won. The Imperial line held for 2 hours. Then it broke. Not from cowardice, but from mathematics. Too few defenders, too many attackers, too little ammunition for the endless hungry green. Units fell back in fighting retreat toward Iron Gate, leaving the trenches to the enemy. Third Squad, now numbering 7, withdrew with the others through hell. The sky burned with falling ordnance. The ground shook from impact craters and orc artillery. They ran through a killing field where the dead outnumbered the living, where the screams of the wounded merged into a single sustained note of agony. Guardsman Mikkel Jost took a round through the leg and could not run. Hennick tried to carry him. Jost put his last pistol under his own chin and ended it before he could become a burden. They left him in the mud and ran on. Survival was its own kind of sin. They reached Iron Gate's outer walls as night fell completely. The fortress was a vision of Imperial might reduced to rubble. Great walls breached, Gothic towers collapsed, the Aquila standards burning on their poles. Inside, the last defenders gathered in the central keep. Perhaps 500 guardsmen from a dozen shattered regiments, a handful of Militarum Tempestus scions in carapace armor, 3 Lehman Rust tanks down to their final shells. No commissars remained to enforce discipline. They were all dead, killed by orcs or by desperate guardsmen who chose quick execution over the slow horror of orbital bombardment. Colonel Marcus Vane, the regimental commander, stood atop the keep's battlements, his dress uniform still immaculate despite the apocalypse around him. He addressed them over voxcasters with the calm certainty of a man who had accepted his death. "We hold until dawn. Reinforcements are en route. The Emperor protects." Everyone knew he was lying. Everyone was grateful for the lie. In the fortress's medici bay, they tended their wounds with supplies already running low. Third Squad now numbered 5. Sergeant Morten Craik, Guardsman Jens Valar, Guardsman Paul Hennig, Guardsman Anders Tove, and Guardsman Mikkel Chef, 2 survivors from Vex's platoon who had attached themselves to Craik's leadership. 5 men from the 11 who had laughed nervously in the Valkyrie that morning. 5 men from the 70,000 conscripted on Brontium. They sat in silence, cleaning weapons with ritualistic care, because ritual was the last barrier between soldier and animal. Hennig tried to joke about the odds. No one laughed. Valar checked his blade's edge for the 100th time. Craik wrote a final letter to his wife that would never reach her, his handwriting steady despite everything. Outside, the orcs gathered for the final assault. Inside, 5 men prepared to become ghosts. The night passed with the slowness of dreams. They took positions along the inner wall, staring out at an ocean of orc campfires that stretched beyond sight. The enemy celebrated their coming victory with guttural songs and the clash of weapons on shields. The sound was almost hypnotic, a rhythm of violence that would not end when this fortress fell. Somewhere in the darkness, orcs were already sporing, spreading their taint to ensure that even if the Imperium reclaimed this world, it would never be clean again. Tove, a quiet man who had spoken perhaps 3 sentences since joining the squad, broke the silence. "Will anyone remember us?" Craik did not answer immediately. Then, "The Imperium will record that the 121st Brontian Longknives fought at Malachite Prime. Our names will be a footnote in a data file read by no one. Will be a single digit in casualty reports, but will be remembered. It was not comfort, but it was truth." The final assault began at dawn, announced by the roar of 10,000 orc throats and the whistle of crude rockets. The walls shook from the impact of battering rams and improvised explosives. Guardsmen fired down into the mass, their last fire utterly insufficient against the tide. The Lehman Russ tanks fired their last shells, each one carving trenches through orc bodies, and then fell silent, their ammunition expended. Scions descended from the walls to fight in the breach, their hell guns reaping a toll measured in seconds before the green wave overwhelmed them. Colonel Vane stood at his post until an orc slugger round took him in the chest. He died standing up, propped against the battlements, his eyes still fixed on the enemy. The command structure dissolved. What remained were individual squads making their own decisions, fighting their own wars in the shrinking pocket of the Emperor's territory. Third Squad held the eastern tower, the 5 of them against a vertical ocean. They had 63 last charges remaining between them, 8 frag grenades and Valar's knife. It would not be enough. It was never meant to be enough. The orcs came up the tower stairs in waves, and they met them at each landing. Hennig threw grenades that turned the stairwell into a slaughterhouse. Craik and Tove fired in sequence, each shot placed with the precision of men who understood ammunition as prayer. Chef wielded his lasgun as a club when the power pack failed. Valar killed with a mechanical efficiency, his blade wet to the hilt. They gave up the first landing, then the second. The tower had 4 levels. They would die on the 4th, in a room that still bore faded murals of the god Emperor enthroned. It seemed fitting. In the final room, they stacked furniture into a barricade that would buy them seconds at most. Craik checked his chronometer. 0847 hours, 3 hours since the assault began. Outside, Irongate was an ocean of green bodies and scattered Imperial resistance. The Vox crackled one last time with a transmission from orbit. "This is Navy frigate Undaunted. Malachite Prime is lost. Exterminatus protocols authorized. All Imperial forces, you have 6 hours to evacuate. The Emperor protects." 6 hours. They had survived this long through skill and chance in equal measure. They would not survive 6 more. Evacuation was impossible. They were already ghosts, haunting a fortress that would be ashes before nightfall. Craig looked at his men, his brothers, his squad, his entire world, and saw acceptance. "Then we hold the room," he said. "Make them pay for every meter." The orcs hit the door like a battering ram of flesh and violence. The barricade held for 15 seconds, then collapsed under the weight of bodies. Lasfire lit the darkness, each shot a star dying in the void. Guardsman Anders Tove died first, pulled over the barricade and torn apart. Guardsman Mikael Chef killed 3 orcs before a chopper took his head. Hennig fought with his empty laser gun as a club, laughing the same laugh that had echoed in the crashed Valkyrie, laughing until an axe ended the sound. Valor moved through the chaos like death incarnate, his knife finding vitals with surgical precision. He killed 9 orcs before they dragged him down, and even then he kept fighting, kept cutting, until the green tide drowned him. Sergeant Morton Craig stood alone in the center of the room, his laser gun empty, his sidearm spent, his hand still reaching for a weapon that did not exist. Craig thought of his wife in that final moment, of the child he would never meet, born into a galaxy where their father's sacrifice would be measured as acceptable losses in endless war. He thought of his squad, Valar's silence, Hennig's fear transformed to courage, Joss' faith that had seemed like madness but might have been the sanest thing in this insane universe. He thought of all the men of Brontium who had boarded transports and never returned, their lives spent like ammunition for a war that would outlive stars. He raised his empty hands as the orcs closed in, not in surrender but in defiance, a final gesture that said, "I was here. I mattered. Remember me." The orcs did not understand the gesture. They ended him quickly, and Sergeant Morton Craig became memory, became dust, became one more name in an infinite ledger of the fallen. Bastion Irongate fell at 0923 hours. The orcs claimed it for 17 minutes before orbital bombardment began. The Navy frigate Undaunted unleashed cyclonic torpedoes from high anchor, and Malachite Prime's northern hemisphere ignited. The blast wave consumed fortress, orcs, and the scattered bodies of 5,000 Imperial Guardsmen. Rock turned to glass. Atmosphere boiled away. The planet died cleanly, its infection purged by fire. In the cold mathematics of Imperial strategy, it was the correct decision. One world sacrificed to prevent a sector's fall. The orcs would spore again elsewhere, and the war would continue. It always continued. But for 17 minutes, the green tide had held an Imperial fortress, had tasted victory. Then they burned with everything else, reduced to ash and silence. In the Administratum archives on Distant Terra, a single line was recorded in the campaign ledger. 121st Brontian Long Knives, deployed Malachite Prime, 973.M41. Status, total casualties. Notation, regiment performed adequately. Tithe quota replacement requested from Brontium. Next conscription cycle, 977.M41. 70,000 men reduced to bureaucratic notation. Their training, their fear, their courage, their deaths, all compressed into a status update and a request for replacement. This is the truth of the Imperial Guard. Not glory, but grinding attrition. not heroes, but acceptable losses. They died as they were always meant to die, forgotten, unmourned. Their sacrifice a rounding error in casualty reports stretching back 10,000 years. But this record remains, assembled from salvaged Vox logs and personnel files, from the testimony of Navy crew who witnessed the final bombardment, from the scattered evidence of men who lived and died in the Emperor's name. The faces in the pic footage are barely visible, Crake's slight smile, Valor's dead eyes, Hennick's youth not yet worn away, Joss' hand raised in prayer, Courtner cleaning his flamer. 11 men who became 10, became 7, became 5, became memory. They were not exceptional. They were not legendary. They were ordinary men ground down by extraordinary horror, and they did their duty because duty was all they understood. This is the Imperium of man, built on mountains of such men, sustained by oceans of their blood. On Brontium, Crake's wife received notification of his death 6 months after Malachite Prime burned. The standard form letter praised his sacrifice and assured her that the God Emperor valued his service. She received no details of how he died, where he fell, or whether his end was quick. The Departmentum Munitorum does not deal in such specifics. She remarried within the year, as practical necessity demanded in hive cities where survival requires 2 incomes. The child Craig never met grew up never knowing their father's face. In 3 generations, even his name would be forgotten, lost among the billions who disappear into the war machine and never return. This is the mathematics of imperial service. 1 father, 1 son, 1 life measured as resource expended. 4 years after Malachite Prime, a new tithe was levied from Brontium. Another 70,000 souls were loaded onto transports, given numbers stripped of their names. Among them was a young man from the lower hives who had once been promised he would not follow his father to war. He went anyway because the Imperium requires it. He would deploy to a different war, on a different world, under a different regimental designation. He would die in the same manner, quickly, violently, forgotten. This is the cycle: conscription, deployment, death, replacement. The machine does not pause. The war does not end. Each generation feeds its sons and daughters to the grinder, and each generation forgets the names of those consumed. But in the silence between wars, in the brief moments when soldiers wait in trenches for the assault that will kill them, they tell stories. They speak of squads that held impossible positions. They name sergeants who led with honor in honorless wars. They remember brothers who died bravely even when bravery meant nothing. These stories are not recorded in official histories. They exist only in the oral tradition of the Guard, passed from veteran to conscript, distorted and embellished until fact becomes legend. Somewhere in those stories, a sergeant named Craig holds a tower. A guardsman named Valar fights with a knife. A boy named Hennick laughs in the face of death. The details are wrong, but the truth remains. They fought, and they died, and for 17 minutes they mattered. The Imperium does not build monuments to its common soldiers. There are no statues of Sergeant Craig on Brontium, no shrines to 3rd Squad in the ruins of Malachite Prime. The fortress they died defending no longer exists, its atoms scattered across a dead world surface, its name removed from Imperial charts. But in every Imperial Guard regiment, in every trench and bunker and transport hold, there are men like Craig, sergeants who keep their squads alive one more day, soldiers who face impossible odds with nothing but duty and a lasgun, brothers who die for each other because the Imperium they serve has forgotten them already. These men are the true foundation of humanity's defense, Not the Space Marines in their glory, not the Navy in its void fortresses, but ordinary humans choosing to stand when every instinct screams to run. In the year 982 M41, 9 years after Malachite Prime, an administratum audit discovered an error in the 121st Brontian's casualty reports. A data slate had been misfiled, containing recovered Vox logs from 3rd Squad's final stand. The recordings were poor quality, distorted by interference, corrupted by heat damage, barely intelligible. But fragments remained. Crake's voice giving orders with mechanical calm, Hennick's laugh echoing through static. Valar's silence speaking louder than words. The final transmission ended mid-sentence. Crake's last words, "We hold the..." and then nothing. The audit clerk listened once, filed the recording in Archive Section Gamma 447, subsection Minor Historical Artifacts, and moved on to the next file. The data slate joined trillions of others, buried in the vast memory of the Imperium, forgotten but preserved. A voice crying out from the past, saying only, "We were here." This is what remains of the 121st Brontian Longknives, 5th Company, 2nd Platoon, 3rd Squad. A misfiled data slate containing 17 minutes of corrupted audio. A single pic capture showing 11 faces that would be dead within weeks. A casualty report noting acceptable losses. A widow who remarried and forgot. A child who never knew his father's name. And this record, assembled centuries later by a remembrancer tasked with documenting not heroes, but the ordinary men who bleed for the Imperium every day. They were not legends. They were not exceptional. They were simply soldiers, afraid, faithful, doomed, who did what they were ordered to do and died where they were told to die. The strategic outcome of Malachite Prime was recorded as mixed. Imperial casualties totaled 512,000 guardsmen, 378 armoured vehicles, 2 Navy vessels, and 17 months of material production. Enemy casualties were estimated at 400,000 orcs eliminated via orbital bombardment, with spore contamination persisting on 16 worlds. The Orc advance was delayed by 2 years before resuming along a different vector. In the grand calculus of Imperial warfare, this represented acceptable exchange rates. The war continued. It always continues. The meat grinder turned, fed by fresh conscripts from 10,000 worlds, and the galaxy burned on. But if you listen carefully to the stories told in Imperial Guard regiments across the galaxy, you will hear echoes. A sergeant on Armageddon who held a bunker until ammunition ran out. A squad on Cadia who died defending a name no one remembers. Veterans who speak of brothers lost in wars without glory, on worlds whose names have been stricken from records. Each story is different in its details, but identical in its truth. The Imperium endures not through the strength of its heroes, but through the sacrifice of its forgotten. Every lasgun fired, every trench held, every order followed unto death. These are the atoms of Imperial survival. 3rd Squad was one atom among trillions, but atoms, accumulated across 10,000 years, become mountains. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. This is not a metaphor or a warning. It is a statement of fact. The Imperium of Man stands besieged on all sides by enemies that outnumber humanity 1,000-fold. Its territories span 1,000,000 worlds, each one a potential battleground. Its armies number in the billions, and still it is not enough. Every day regiments are raised, deployed and destroyed. Every day worlds fall or are saved by margins measured in lives expended. Every day men like Sergeant Morton Craik wake in the darkness, check their weapons, and march toward battles they will not survive. They do this not because they are heroes, but because the alternative is extinction. The 121st Brontian Long Knives no longer exists. The regiment was reformed twice in the decades following Malachite Prime, but each iteration bore only the name. None of the men, none of the history, none of the spirit that Craig and his brothers carried into battle. The current 121st fights on a world whose name does not matter, against an enemy whose nature is irrelevant. They will fight until they are destroyed, and then the Departamento Militarum will raise another 121st, and another, because the Imperium requires it. This is the immortality offered to Imperial soldiers, not the preservation of the individual, but the endless repetition of their sacrifice. The names change, the faces change, the wars never do. This record is complete. The data files have been compiled, the Vox logs transcribed, the casualty reports cross-referenced. 3rd Squad, 121st Brontian Long Knives, deployed to Malachite Prime in the year 973 M41, and was destroyed in action after 72 hours of combat. They held their ground. They followed their orders. They died as soldiers of the Imperium. Their names are recorded here, not as a memorial, but as evidence, proof that they existed, that they mattered for the brief moment they drew breath. Sergeant Morton Craig, Guardsman Jens Wahler, Guardsman Paul Hennig, Guardsman Lev Kortner, Guardsman Mikkel Jost, and 6 others whose names were lost when the data slate corrupted. 11 men who became ghosts. This is their requiem. This is their testimony. They were Imperial Guardsmen. They served. They fell. They will not be forgotten. Not while this record endures. Not while the Imperium stands. Not while there are still men willing to march into the darkness, carrying nothing but faith and a laser gun. The Emperor protects, but it is men who bleed. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war.